You are listening to Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. If the U.S. Supreme Court does not intervene on his behalf in the next 2 days, Sean Sellers will become the first person in 40 years to be executed in the United States for committing a crime when he was 16 years old. He's scheduled to be killed by lethal injection in Oklahoma's death chamber this Wednesday night at 1 minute past midnight. Sellers, who's now 29 years old, has been on death row since 1985, when he was sentenced to die for killing 3 people: Robert Bauer, a store owner, his mother, and his stepfather. He said he shot all 3 to death as part of a satanic ritual. Sellers' case has attracted national attention, as much for his age as for the work he's done from his cell in the past few years, counseling disturbed youth and helping parents to see the first signs of trouble in their teenage children. According to Sellers and to doctors who've examined him, the brutal abuse he suffered as a child may have led to a multiple personality disorder, and they also say it was during several of his psychotic episodes that he killed all 3 victims. A few days ago, I had the chance to interview Sean Sellers by telephone from his prison cell at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. It was the day before the State Board of Pardons and Paroles was to hold a hearing to decide whether to grant him clemency, and he appeared somewhat hopeful that the board members would be sympathetic to his plea. The board denied him clemency by a 5-0 vote. What follows is a chilling interview with this young man as he explains the downward spiral of his youth that led to brutality and death. He peppered his descriptions of what happened to him and of what he did with chilling detail. The interview was conducted over the telephone with poor sound quality due to the lines. It's very difficult to get through to someone at a penitentiary. Sean Sellers is at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, Oklahoma. When I asked him to speak up more, he said if he shouted, he would not be able to concentrate on his thoughts. When we started talking, he explained how he had been inducted into a satanic ritual and a whole satanic way of life when he was very young. And then at the age of 16, he got involved with 3 murders, the first being Robert Bauer's. After he described the whole induction into the satanic ritual, he described what happened on the night that he killed the man who worked in a grocery store. This is Sean Sellers. Again, listen carefully. The sound quality is terrible. After you listen to this description by Sean over the next 2 segments, we'll go to a psychiatrist who's just examined him, who will talk about multiple personality disorder. Sean Sellers.
We went to a Circle K convenience store where there was a man who fit the description of what the Satanic Bible called a human sacrifice. He was a man that in our teenage minds didn't matter, wouldn't be missed, and had done something that we thought deserved death. I had told Richard several times that I wondered what it felt like to kill somebody. He had refused to sell Richard some beer, and he had said something about Richard's girlfriend. And so this seemed like the man that we would sacrifice to Satan. Richard found his grandfather's .357 revolver, and he gave it to me. And we put a .22 rifle in the seat. And we drove to that store, and on the way there, we dedicated our time to Satan. We dedicated what we were about to do to Satan. And we got to that store, and we talked to this man for about an hour. Richard was there often, seeing his girlfriend, and then going there afterwards to get a Coke and get some gas before he went home. So on this midnight shift, he was often there, and the man knew him and talked to him. We talked to the man for over an hour. We made sure that there were no cameras anywhere. And then we asked him to come out to our car to check Richard's clutch. We had just put a new clutch in his car, and the man had talked about having clutch problems, and so Richard wanted to show him his. I sat on top of the gun while he checked the clutch in that car, and Richard and him carried a conversation on. As he went back into the store, Richard turned to me and said, "Let's do it." And I nodded. And I picked up that gun and I started to walk into the store, but for some reason I couldn't do it. Something inside me just was saying, "No, this is real. This is not what we're here for." Talking about it and doing it are 2 different things. So I stopped and I went around to the side of the store. And my heart was beating hard, and I took a breath, and I was about to call it off, I think. I don't know if I was or not, but I know that I was very nervous. something clicked inside my head. It's hard to describe. It's just kind of a transformation. Just 1 minute I'm all nervous, and all of a sudden, click, I'm calm, and I'm determined, and I'm cold. And I stood up, and I walked into the store. And Richard saw me coming, and he distracted the man. And I brought the gun up, and I fired at him, and I missed. And I fired again, and I missed. The man ran from us. He got confused. He didn't know who was who, I think. And he almost ended up running right into me. And I heard Richard yell, "Do it!" And I fired again. And I knocked this man down. Blood went everywhere. And we walked out of that store. And on our way home, we laughed about how stupid he was and how foolish he was to trust us and how unsuspecting he was. We'd gone there and all we did was kill a man. We didn't take any money. We didn't steal anything. We just killed a man. After that, there were times when I remembered it and there were times when I didn't. There were times whenever I was cold and calculated and I thought I was superior. I was a Satanist who had taken a life and I proved my allegiance to Satan. And then there were times when I was just a 16-year-old boy and I had no knowledge of what I had done. If you had asked me what I had done, I would have said, "Yeah, right. Yeah, sure, yeah." I had no idea what I had done. 6 months went by. Richard got married to his girlfriend, Tracy. I was the best man at his wedding. I had a girlfriend named Angel. And I loved her very much, but my mom had been 15 years old when she got pregnant with me. She was 16 when I was born. Angel was 15. We were dating, and she saw Angel, and she saw herself at 15, and she wanted me to have nothing to do with that girl. She called her a bitch and a slut and a whore, and the more I tried to go out with her, and the more that I dated her, the angrier my mother got, until we got into arguments over it and fights over it. I decided I needed to move out. It was time for me to leave. So my mom and I got into an argument one night, and she said, "Fine, you want out? Fine. Pack your shit and get the fuck out." That's just the way she talked. That's the way she said it. Richard and I were ecstatic about it. That's what we wanted. So we packed everything we had, and we moved all my stuff to his aunt's house, and I left my mom and dad a note so that whenever they came home from going out dancing and having fun that night, they found my bed and my cat and that note. And I said I would be back for those two the next day, and we could talk about it then. But my father, he wouldn't have it. He decided that I wasn't going to move out. I wasn't going to go anywhere. He came and got me at work. He told me to get my butt home. I came home. He said, "You're going to live here until you're 18 years old. You're not going anywhere. You're going to do as you're told." And that's it. That's the end of it. That's all there is to it. Came a time whenever I wanted out of Satanism. And I tried to get out because I didn't like what was going on inside me. This was before I ever hurt anybody. This was before I ever killed anybody. For a week, I had tried to get out of Satanism, but it didn't work. No one knew what to tell me. I went and saw a priest. I went to a prayer group. I called a prayer line. I tried to reach a pastor. Nobody knew what to tell me. Nobody knew how to tell me to get out of Satanism. I thought I had sold my soul, so I was stuck in it. It seemed like every time I turned around, I was trapped one way or another. I couldn't move out. I couldn't get out of Satanism. I was beginning to lose control of my mind. I woke up driving my pickup. I didn't know where I was going or where I'd been. I woke up at school in third hour and didn't remember getting there. I didn't remember getting up in the morning or coming to school or first or second hour. And I told a teacher that I needed somebody to talk to, that I wasn't doing very well. One night, I was on the phone with my girlfriend at Safeway on my way home from work. And something inside me snapped again. And I decided the only way that I was going to be able to leave that house was to get rid of my parents. To this day, I don't think I was consciously understood that I was going to kill them. I think it was just my way of getting rid of them. But I took my father's .44 revolver from his bureau drawer beside his bed before they went to bed, And when they went to bed, I walked into their room, and I shot them both in the head. Then I went to Richard's house, and he and I together concocted a story. And we found the bodies the next day and pretended everything was okay. We pretended like we didn't know anything about it. The next day after that, I think Richard got scared. He turned us in. He gave the police both the guns. And I was arrested. And they told me I was arrested for killing my parents. And I told them I didn't say anything to them, but in my mind, I said, no way. It didn't happen. It was 3 days later before I fully understood that my parents were dead. And when I really understood that they were gone, that they were dead, I cried myself to sleep. I tried to say that it wasn't happening, it was a nightmare, but it was real. The day it happened, when Angel found me at Mazio's Pizza where I worked, she held me and I cried like a baby in her arms, and those tears were real. Richard was charged with first-degree murder, but the only evidence they had against us was his testimony. And so they dropped that first-degree murder charge, and they gave him a 5 years deferred sentence, which was the equivalent of 5 years probation, in exchange for his testimony against me. And he walked out of jail, and he came to the trial, and he testified against me, and I was given the death penalty. I was sentenced to death for 3 murders. I was 16 years old when I committed the crime. I came to death row at 17, and I've been here ever since. When a psychologist named Dorothy Lewis began to go around the country and do psychological evaluations on young death row inmates, I became part of this little study that she was doing, and I saw her, and she testified that, she diagnosed me as some type of schizotypical schizophrenia. A psychologist at my trial said that if I committed the crimes, I was probably, in his opinion, I was unconscious at the time that I did it, that I didn't know what I was doing. A couple of years later, a new lawyer invited Dr. Dorothy Lewis back to do some more evaluations on me, and she decided that after she had done some more tests, that it was possible that I had MPD, multiple personality disorder. When a church group decided to help us out and fund our defense a little bit for the next appeal, they spent over $10,000 on the psychological testing, and they brought in a psychologist, a neurologist, and a psychiatrist, and they put me on through all kinds of tests, and they put an EEG to my brain and mapped all the brain waves there, and they confirmed it beyond a doubt. They said, Sean, you have MPD. I told them I thought they were dreaming. I told them I didn't have it. I've seen Sybil, and that's not me. But they said the EEG confirms it. You have the MPD. You can't fake alternate brain waves. It's a fact. And suddenly these things began to kind of make sense. I didn't like that diagnosis, but I kind of understood why, when I was a kid, I heard voices, and why when I woke up at school, I didn't remember where I had been or what I was doing, why there were missing time, and why I felt like different people all my life. Things that I never had words for kind of made sense, but I still didn't like the idea that I was insane. And that's what people were saying, and I was very uncomfortable with that. It's only been recently that I've even kind of accepted it fully, because only this year, some more people that I've known have told me things about my childhood and about my teenage years that I still to this day do not remember, and I know they're not lying. So it seems to me that it was a combination of MPD and the belief system that I acquired as a Satanist that contributed to this.
You're listening to Sean Sellers, a prisoner from death row in Oklahoma at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, describing the crimes he committed 13 years ago when he was 16 years old. He has since been diagnosed with multiple personality disorder. We'll be speaking with his psychiatrist in a little while, but he hasn't finished his descriptions. This is Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now! This is The Last Word. That is Sean Sellers, 29 years old, scheduled to die on Thursday at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Committed 3 murders when he was 16 years old. He's since been diagnosed with multiple personality disorder. We'll hear more about that later, but we now go back to Sean Sellers himself, speaking on a very bad phone line to us from the penitentiary just a few days ago.
And it felt like warm honey was poured over my head. It's a sensation I have a hard time describing, but it was like this electrical sensation of warmth that just started at the top of my head and went down my body and into my legs and into my feet. And when I felt that, I began to just cry and weep, and that was something I had not done in months. I felt like all my tears had dried up as a Satanist. But I began to cry and pour myself out to God and say, Lord, I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. I quit smoking. I was in the county jail for 8 months waiting for trial, and I spent that 8 months praying and learning about God and reading my Bible. And when I came to death row, I came here to die. I was 17 years old, and while the jury had deliberated, I said, Father, if there's nothing for me to do, then give me death and let me come home. I had killed my mother and my stepfather and some hurt that I didn't even know. What was there for me in life? So when I came to death row, I came here to die. And I found out you can't do that. You cannot end your appeals on the first appeal. You have to take the first appeal. It's mandatory. Your direct appeal is not waivable. And I was told it was going to be 2 years at least before my direct appeal was put through. So I had to learn how to live on death row for at least 2 years. I began to think about that week that I tried to get out of Satanism, that week that I went to the prayer group and I went to the Catholic priest and I went to the preacher and I went to the prayer line, and nobody could tell me what I needed to hear. And I said, that will never happen again. Nobody will ever come to death row because they couldn't get out of Satanism. I started doing interviews and speaking against the occult. I started educating the church about how to see the signs of Satanism in their children and how to reach them. I wrote a book called Web of Darkness where I gave my testimony and talked about the occult and showed people how to watch for things. It was 4 years before my appeal went through. And when it finally did, I had found a purpose to live. I'd found a reason to keep going. I didn't want to die anymore. Ever since then, I've been doing things. I've been writing books. I've been reaching out to people. I founded a ministry called Radical Teens for Christ, and for several years I wrote teenagers and ministered to them on the phone until the prison decided that I was involved in some type of business, and they shut it down. They said I could not do that anymore. And then I began to get a vision for reaching out to people in youth juvenile detention centers, and I began putting material together for that. I've been working for several years on that. I've written a discipleship course and some books and some things to reach out to these kids. I began working in Christian comic books because I'd always loved comic books as a kid, and it was a dark industry full of occultism and violence. And I worked for about a solid year, and we just published a comic book called Donjanhofen. It's a black and white comic with a full-color cover. It's a year's work that I published by Mood Comics and friends of mine who share this vision. And I've been spending every day of my life since then trying to reach out to people, trying to make up for what I did. I don't think I will, but my dad always told me that if you do nothing, you're all wrong. But if you do something, the worst you can be is half wrong, because at least you tried.
Sean Sellers, I wanted to ask you about the claim that your lawyers are making of multiple personality disorder. The Attorney General, Drew Edmondson of Oklahoma, says there's not a shred of evidence that you suffer some kind of mental disorder, that you suffered it at the time of the murders. And he went on to say, if he suffers from it now, then the issue is whether he's competent. And my goodness, the guy's got a website. He's giving interviews. I haven't heard a member of the news media suggest he's not competent when they've talked to him. The Governor Frank Keating of Oklahoma, said he will consider granting clemency if it's recommended by the Pardon and Parole Board, but says he's skeptical of your MPD claim. He said, I have a more cynical view of the entire defense. I would propose that we execute the personality that did it. What's your response to that?
As for Drew Edmondson's never going to say anything but that because he has a political agenda, and he's not interested in the truth. He's interested in seeing me executed. I've come to terms with that. Nothing I ever do will ever convince the man of anything else. As for Governor Keating, I took care of that for him. I'm not the person that I was. The person that committed those murders doesn't exist anymore inside of me. When they diagnosed me with MPD, I didn't believe it at first, and I struggled against it. But I spent about 2 hours, I spent about 2 years learning here how not to dissociate. I didn't even know I was doing it until they pointed it out to me. I learned how not to dissociate, and I don't hear voices anymore. The parts of me that did that are not there anymore. They're gone. But I understand their skepticism, and I understand how they feel about it. I share some of those same thoughts. I share some of those same beliefs, but I don't have any easy answers. I don't want to live because I had MPD. I don't think that that's an excuse for what I did. I don't think it's a justification. The only reason that I want to live is because I want to keep doing what I'm doing.
Sean,
I'm trying to reach out to the kids still.
There's a coalition effort to save your life. The ACLU, Amnesty International, National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, Bianca Jagger, all holding a news conference for you today, appealing to the governor and the Board of Pardons and Paroles. Can you describe where you are in the H unit of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, what it's like to be entirely underground? Amnesty International has criticized it as being cruel and inhuman punishment in a report. What is it like there?
They built a building made out of prefabricated concrete. And they said that they kind of dug a hole and they put foundation in that hole, and then they covered the building with dirt so that it looks like a kind of a big mound that you walk into. So we are effectively underground. Everything is made out of cement and solid steel. There are not very many bars here. There are some, but they are big round pipes. We have doors that are solid steel with a glass in them and then pipe bars across them. There are 2 people in every cell, and most of us on death row are now double cells. That means that you spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in the cell with your cell partner. You go to the shower with him, you go to the yard with him, you're never away from him at all. If we use the telephone, we use it in our cells. If we eat in our cells. The only time we leave our cells is for yard, shower, law library visits, and attorney visits. When they moved me to a 60-day notice, they moved me into a super maximum security cell. This is a cell that actually has 2 doors instead of 1. In between the 2 doors, there's a shower area. I am cut off from the rest of the inmate population here. I don't get to see anybody or talk to anybody. I go to the yard by myself now. Every time I leave this cell, I go in handcuffs and leg shackles. If a guard brings me something, there has to be 2 of them to do so. I don't have my art supplies anymore, and I didn't have any warm clothes until it was too cold in the cell, and the warden approved for me to buy a sweatshirt. I have my television and my radio, and I'm allowed to do all the writing that I need to do in here. I have all the writing materials and books and things like that. Mm-hmm. But I don't, I'm completely isolated from everybody now.
Right now you're on death watch because you are about to be executed unless a stay of execution comes down?
Right. And on death watch, they come and count me every night, every half hour, and they open this first door and they peek in here to see that I'm still here and I'm still alive, and then they slam that door shut and they come back half an hour and they do it again. And from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning, that happens all night long. At first, I could not sleep because of that, and I had to learn how to roll some toilet paper up and make myself some earplugs with it and get used to the constant noise. I've been here for 13 years, and I've never been isolated the way I am right now. It's in a way, it's comforting because I don't have to deal with anybody else. It's just me and God alone in this cell. And in some ways, it's kind of stressful because I can't get hold of the guards whenever I need something. I have to beat on the door, and because there are two doors, it is very difficult for them to hear in the control room 100 feet away. So I have to bang and bang and bang and bang on the door until someone hears me or until another inmate flashes them with a mirror and gets their attention and tells them that they need to call me. Then they call me on the intercom, and I tell them what I need, and they will get to me whenever it's convenient for them or whenever they have the time.
Sean, Amnesty International estimates a third of the people on death row at your prison. How many are there?
About 150, roughly.
That a third of them, 50, are insane because of the conditions which they call torture.
No, I don't think it's that many, but there are people here who, until we moved to this building, death row was kind of an open place where we got to talk to each other quite a bit, and it wasn't really very bad. The still house was hot in the summertime, but we had windows we could open, and we could see outside, and we had open barred doors where we could go up and talk to each other, and most of us were single-celled. Here, we have had several inmates into their appeals because they cannot live under these conditions anymore. When you come here, it looks all nice and clean and pristine, but living in a cell with somebody else 24 hours a day and being isolated from everybody else is very stressful. Most of us have opted to, instead of sleeping on the bunk, one of the people in the cell will move down to the floor, and that gives us some distance away from each other. Or they will hang a blanket in the cell so that they don't have to look at each other all the time. You have to hang a blanket or a sheet up whenever you use the bathroom because there's no privacy like that. It's a kind of constant stress that these guys have decided that they don't want to deal with anymore, and so they've ended their appeals and opted for death rather than living here.
Sean, did you know Nguyen Yen, who was executed on December 10th?
We called him Tuan, and when Tuan first got here, he was a little bitty Vietnamese guy. He was only about 4 feet tall or something. He was a little bitty guy. And when Tuan first got here and found out that his direct appeal would take 2 years to go through, he really freaked about that. That was devastating to him. He was showering with somebody, and whoever it was tried to rape him. And Tuan, who had been a very outgoing person and had played basketball and had talked to everybody on the yard, flooded the run with water and took a stinger and plugged it in the wall, cut the cord off of it, threatened to put that electrical cord in the water if anybody stepped in it. He said he wanted to go to lockup, so they obliged him. They took him. 30 days later, when they brought Tuan back, he never spoke a word to anybody ever again. He went out in the yard and he walked around in a little bitty circle all by himself until we started calling him Little Doodle Bug. As far as I know, he never talked to anybody here. I wasn't around him whenever we moved to the H unit. We have 2 quads here, and I was usually on the other side. But he quit calling his family. He quit talking to his attorneys. He quit talking to anybody. He withdrew within himself, and he kind of dissociated himself away from all life. He turned his back upon life. And they came and got him one day and took him away, and they executed him.
Sean, do you counsel other people on death row?
Yeah, when I can. I've been here a long time, so I'm kind of one of the grandpas here, I'm one of the old-timers on death row. And I've noticed as I've been here that more and more people are coming here younger. That it used to be grown men were here, and now we've got people under 25 coming here quite often. And it seems like society has turned their back on their youth, and they've given up even trying to make any difference, even trying to reach them. So these young guys that come here, I've tried to help them and tell them that they have to find something to do here. This place will kill them, before the state will, if they don't find something to do with their lives. There aren't too many options.
Sean, you're the first 16-year-old offender ever to face execution. What comment do you have on that? Sorry. You're the first 16-year-old offender ever to face execution in 40 years. What comment do you have on that?
If we look at it legally, I say this. It's hard for me to talk about this because I really don't like defending myself. I don't like saying that this is wrong. I have to look at it and say, if there was another 16-year-old out there, would I try to defend him? And yes, I would. And so I speak on it in principle, not because it's me. And what I say is that at 16 years old, you cannot vote. At 16 years old, you cannot buy alcohol. You cannot buy cigarettes. At 16 years old, you cannot be drafted and made to die for your country. So how is it at 16 years old you can be made to die for your crimes? I don't think that's right. I think that we as a society have acknowledged that 16-year-olds are not mature enough to be responsible with adult decisions. So why are we making them responsible for adult penalties?
There are those, Sean, who would say, well, you were old enough to kill 3 people, 2 of them being your parents, and that you should die for having taken the lives of 3 other people. What is your response to that?
I think the same thing myself very often. I can't argue against that because it's hard enough for me to live here and to try to keep fighting. The only reason that I do is because I still think that I can make a difference in other people's lives, and I haven't finished what I've started. But if we define justice as revenge, then yes, I should die for my crimes. If we define justice by law, then the law says that I should not be on death row. The federal court said that the state court erred in my case and that I was not supposed to be kept here, that I should have been overturned. But the federal court said they couldn't do anything about it because it wasn't a constitutional error. It was just a state error. So if we follow the law, the only way to execute me now is to break the law. If justice is connected to law, then we can say the execution of a 16-year-old, in this case, is justice. But, like I said, I don't like defending myself like that. It's not for me to do.
If your sentence was commuted to life in prison without parole, could you see yourself living the rest of your life in jail?
Yeah, and that's not something I take lightly because I think I'd rather die than do that. But I keep going back to the fact that there are still books that I want to write, and there are still things that I think I can do. I still believe that I can make a difference. And don't think that I pass off what I do easily. That I don't care about what I did. I want to die sometimes because I know the hurt that I caused people, and there's nothing I can ever do to change that. I struggle with that all the time between life and death. But I believe more in what I can do if I live than in the peace that I would feel if I was dead.
Sean Sellers, finally, are you prepared to die?
I came to death row at 17 years old, prepared to die. That has never changed.
Is there one last comment you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I've been asking everybody in the world the same question. Everybody who interviews me, I ask this question, and nobody has been able to give me an answer yet. Here's my question. After a man has done something horrible, after he has hurt people and done something he can never change, is there anything he can ever do afterwards to make up for it?
And you've been listening to Sean Sellers, scheduled to die on Thursday. That's Wednesday night, actually, a minute after midnight. Sean Sellers at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, unless he is granted clemency by the Oklahoma governor, Frank Keating, though Frank Keating says he would only consider such a move if the Board of Paroles recommended it, which they didn't in a 5-0 vote. The board denied him clemency. Just a minute, we'll speak with Sean Sellers, psychiatrist. You're listening to Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute. You are listening to Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman, and you've just been listening to Sean Sellers, who's on death row at Oklahoma State Penitentiary, scheduled to die on Thursday, February 4th. Defenders of Sean Sellers say he suffered from multiple personality disorder as a result of severe child abuse. This ailment was not mentioned at his trial because he had not yet been diagnosed, but his lawyers did raise it later during appeal. And although one of the last courts that he appealed to admitted that his mental condition should be taken into account in his case, the judges ruled that they could not give him relief and that it was up to the state to grant him clemency. We now turn to Dr. Dorothy Lewis. She's a professor of psychiatry at New York University and clinical professor at Yale University Child Studies Center. She examined Sean after he committed the 3 murders, and she testified on his behalf at his clemency hearing last week. By the way, he was denied clemency after that hearing. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Dr. Dorothy Lewis.
Good to be here.
Well, we've just heard a very chilling description that Sean Sellers himself has given of his life, of the 3 murders that he committed 13 years ago when he was 16. Can you talk about Sean and why you think he should not die?
Yes, I can. I saw Sean in 1987 during a study of 14 juveniles condemned to death in this country, and Sean was one of only two kids who were on death row in Oklahoma at the time. Wayne Thompson, whose sentence was subsequently overturned by the Supreme Court, and Sean. Now, at the time in 87, we knew very, very little about multiple personality disorder. It's now called dissociative identity disorder. And at the time, his symptoms, which were severe and included auditory hallucinations, false beliefs, the feeling that he was possessed by the devil, and a myriad of very odd symptoms, including drinking blood and these sorts of things. At that time, I and the entire clinical crew down there diagnosed schizophrenia in this boy. And then in 1991, I was asked to evaluate Sean again for purposes of an appeal. And at that time, I came to see him again. By that time, someone else had already recognized that he suffered from dissociative identity disorder, and I was asked to come down to see whether I concurred and to complete the evaluation. And I began the evaluation, and I had the evaluation videotaped, and was prepared to continue with it. And a woman named Tony Campisi stole the tapes of the interview and convinced Sean that he should drop the attorney who was working with me, and hence drop me, and said that she would find him a better attorney and better psychiatric assistance. And at that time, his attorney, a very young woman, had said to him that she thought that this was a lethal decision. But again, he was young, and this woman promised him more money for a private lawyer. And I never heard from Sean again until we were doing a follow-up study this summer of the juveniles condemned to death. And then, to my horror and amazement, I learned that a death warrant had been signed for him. And that is how I became involved, first of all, in his case, and second of all, in an attempt to illustrate that in 1987 and even in 1989, it was extremely rare to make that diagnosis in a child or an adolescent. In 1987, it was practically unheard of. And in fact, to the best of my knowledge, only one case of multiple personality in a child had been reported at a meeting, and that was by Richard Kluft in 1984. And we didn't publish our book on the subject of multiple personality in children and adolescents, that's Frank Putnam and I, until 1996, so that it was really unfair to penalize him for the fact that the diagnosis had not been made at the time of his trial.
What does multiple personality disorder mean, and how does it differ from schizophrenia?
When schizophrenia seems to be at least the predisposition to schizophrenia seems to be a heritable disorder, and it seems to be a biochemical disorder or a disorder of brain function, and it tends to run in families, and it has many of the same symptoms, but it is still in terms of auditory hallucinations and delusions. However, let me tell you how multiple personality disorder comes about. When children are subjected to early, ongoing, intolerable physical or sexual abuse, when they cannot endure it, they seem to space out. It's almost, and this is not a conscious thing, it just happens. In order to survive, they experience it as though it were happening to someone else. And they start to experience voices in their head, sometimes very comforting voices, and sometimes, and almost invariably, very violent, aggressive voices that try to defend them. And over time, when they are stressed, when they are further tortured, they switch into these voices, and they become not just imaginary friends, but they space out, and it's as though whatever were happening happened to someone else. And they operate in a way that they have no conscious control over. And over time, this becomes a habit of mind, so that it continues, and it can continue even after after the abuse has long ended. Now, in Sean's case, there's reason to believe that that what he was experiencing continued on into his adolescence, and there is reason to believe that he committed the murders that he committed when he was in an altered state.
We're talking to Dr. Dorothy Lewis, who is a psychiatrist at Yale University and New York University as well, and she is a psychiatrist who has examined Sean Sellers, scheduled to die on Thursday. What kind of traumatic experience did Sean experience as a very young child?
Well, we are still investigating this. Had Sean continued with us, by now this would have been very, very well documented. And unfortunately, I got called in at the last minute, which was about last week or so. But from interviews with relatives, and from Sean is very, very protective. Sean does admit that he was sexually abused. He was sodomized by someone in the family and also by others outside the family. The evidence, the irrefutable evidence that there was sexual abuse was the fact that Sean has scars on his penis to attest to this. He also has scars on his penis from self-mutilation. And this kind of self-mutilation, sticking pins through his penis, and this was long before the murders, is only done either by flamboyantly psychotic individuals or by children who have been hideously abused, so that there is a lot of good evidence that this has occurred. The irony of the disorder is that it comes about in order to protect the child. Very often, the child is dependent on the abuser. So he or she has one personality to deal with the abuser when the abuser is friendly and protective, and another one when the abuser is violent. But the child does not remember it all himself. So you have to be a detective, and you have to have a reasonably good way of relating to people before they open up and tell you some of the things that have happened.
Dr. Lewis, the governor of Oklahoma, Frank Keating, said he would consider granting clemency if it's recommended by the Pardon and Parole Board, which it wasn't, but added he's skeptical of Sellers' multiple personality disorder claim. The governor said, "I have a more cynical view of the entire defense. I would propose we execute the personality that did it, that committed the murders." What's your response to that?
Well, I would have to agree that he had a cynical view, if that's indeed what he said. But in the work that we do, because certainly if you work with violent people or people who've committed murder, there's reason to worry whether somebody is faking a disorder. And so what we do is we gather all of the writings, all of the homework, all of the drawings, everything that, all of the signatures you can find that the person had written or created prior to any thought of that diagnosis and prior to any offense. And I've done that with Sean, and going through the letters and papers, some of which are from the 1980s, some of which are from 1991, before anyone even suspected the diagnosis, you see wildly different signatures and wildly different, well, especially wildly different handwritings. And when I met with Sean after the clemency board had refused him, I showed him some of these letters, and he said to me, "I didn't write that." And I said, "Sean, look, this came from your notebook. Sean, look, this came from your letter." And I would have a letter from the same period of time written to a friend, and then another letter written to the same friend, and the writing was wildly different, and Sean himself had trouble believing he had written. So this is objective evidence that he suffers from the disorder, and this, although it could not have been, I don't think it could have been recognized in 1987. I think we were a pretty sophisticated crew of clinicians then. It certainly is extremely important now that it has been discovered that it be mitigation evidence, because it's mitigation not only because he was suffering from a serious mental disorder, but because it is evidence of early, ongoing, unendurable torture. And that alone, without the disorder, would be mitigation, and especially in a child of 16.
Dr. Lewis, what do you think should happen to Sean Sellers?
I think that the governor should look again at this case. It's a very special case. It's a case that was bungled. It's a case that, first of all, the woman who went off and took these tapes and convinced a boy to drop his attorney, prevented this from coming out in at least a more timely fashion. I think that the governor should stay his execution while we prove to him that this is indeed the case, and that to execute a tortured child, really, who at the time that he did what he did was so sick that our group thought he had paranoid schizophrenia, would be an injustice.
Well, I want to thank you very much for being with us, Dr. Dorothy Lewis, psychiatry professor at New York University School of Medicine and clinical professor at Yale University Child Studies Center, speaking to us from Connecticut. Thank you for being with us. You are listening to Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now!, and that does it for today's program. I can give you a fax number of Oklahoma Governor Frank Keating, again, Sean Sellers, scheduled to die on Thursday at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Governor Frank Keating's fax number is 1-405-521-3353. That's 405-521-3353. And his email address, governor@oklahosf.state.ok.us. That's governor@oklahosf.state.ok.us. You are listening to Democracy Now!, which is produced by Maria Carrion with help from Stephanie Donnie. Our technical director, Errol Maitland. I'm Amy Goodman from the studios of WBAI in New York. Thanks for listening to another edition of Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now!